Tonight, East Texas Congressman Nathaniel Moran hosted the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee in Tyler.
KLTV7's Blake Holland has more from the W.T. Brookshire Conference Center, where the Moran campaign hosted the ticketed gathering.
Tonight's event was a campaign fundraiser for Congressman Moran. They called it Taste of East Texas, and it featured the chair of the House Judiciary Committee, Jim Jordan. Jordan's appearance in Tyler came less than 24 hours after he sent a letter to the Attorney General demanding answers about the FBI's role in the investigation into former President Trump, saying the Mar-a-Lago investigation may have been poisoned with what he calls the FBI's political bias. In the letter, Jordan demands a breakdown of the number of FBI agents working the case and whether or not they previously investigated Trump. It's an effort supported by Congressman Moran.
You know, we're going to have Mr. Durham in front of the committee here in the coming weeks, and we're going to talk about the Durham report, which just excoriates the 2016 presidential campaign investigation that was based on false information, and really is a great example of how government was weaponized against a person that was running for President of the United States.
And while Congressman Moran did take questions before tonight's event, Congressman Jim Jordan did not. In Tyler, Blake Holland, KLTV 7 News.